Let's take a look together at the notes from Chapter 9, Writing and Writing Literature Reviews, which focuses on your guidelines for writing a first draft of the paper. That's what we'll be working on this week. Last week you put together your introduction, and we'll be proceeding from that point all the way through the end of the paper. I will point out that some of the guidelines in this chapter pertain specifically to the introduction section. So some of these will hopefully be things you've already taken care of. Maybe as you look at these guidelines, you can reflect on your introduction to see and consider whether you did take care of those issues. For example, the first guideline is to begin by identifying the broad area, but by avoiding global statements. So this would pertain to the introduction as you're introducing the topic. In general, you go from the broad to the specific, but you don't want to be too broad. For example, if you said higher education is important to both the economy of the United States and to the rest of the world, that would be a little bit too broad because we're talking about all of higher education and the entire world. So we'd want to be a little bit more specific starting out, such as a significant proportion of children are involved in bullying across their school years. So now we know that we are talking about bullying in the school context. So it's still fairly broad, but we can proceed from there. Second guideline, early in the review, indicate why the topic being reviewed is important. Again, this would pertain to the introduction, so maybe think back to make sure you've covered this base. It could be important because of the prevalence of the issue. That would mean it's affecting a large number of people, so this affects 80% of the people in the United States. Clearly, it's an important issue, or it could be important because of the seriousness of the issue. So it perhaps deeply affects at least one population. So maybe it only pertains to 2% of the population in the U.S., but it's a really, really important life or death issue for them. Guideline 3, distinguish between research findings and other sources of information. So this would pertain to the literature review section of your paper. Research findings, you're going to word it basically, findings indicate, or so-and-so found that. And that lets us know that this is the result of an empirical study. Speculation or anecdotal evidence would be written something like this. Smith speculated that. And you'll see that oftentimes in the discussion section of a paper you might be reviewing. They speculate on their findings and say, well, I think this happened because of this, or maybe the results were inconsistent with prior literature because of this, but they didn't actually test it. It's just their informed, educated guess, which is perfectly reasonable to consider, but you just need to articulate that that is the case. Guideline 4, indicate why certain studies are important. This is definitely relevant to the work you're doing this week. If you look at the rubric for the assignment, one of the things we're going to be looking for is that you have emphasized certain studies over others. So you're actually evaluating, you're not just reporting the results, right? You're using a critical mind, and you're actually evaluating the relative merit of these studies. In some cases, you might find conflicting results, and so you want to you'll suggest that, well, perhaps this study is more credible than that study because maybe it had a nationally representative sample. Maybe it had an especially large sample size. It used an experimental design versus just a correlational design. So you want to point those things out in your paper. So we'll be looking for this. Make sure that you apply that as you write this week. Guideline 5. Whenever you're talking about a time frame, usually this pertains to the introduction. People will say things like, there has been an increased interest in the topic of this over the last few years, to sort of introduce their paper. When that happens, you want to be very specific. Cite an actual source and give the actual numbers. Baird reported that college cheating had increased from 23% in 1941, blah, blah, blah. That example would probably come up in your introduction, which you've written. Although in the literature review section, if you're transitioning between studies and you say, perhaps that more research was conducted between this time and this time, be specific. There was 24 studies between these 10 years and only 5 the 10 years after that. Guideline 6, citing a classic or landmark study, identify that. So in any particular field, there's going to be maybe a first study, the first person to conceptualize a construct a certain way, the first person to advance a certain theory, use a key term that you might be citing. You want to be aware of those and cite those identified as a particularly important study in the field. Guideline 7, Continuing from that idea, if a landmark study was replicated, we want to mention that, indicate the results. So a lot of times if there's something really groundbreaking and everyone's interested in it, oh, that's really amazing, they'll repeat it, maybe with slight alterations, maybe with the same methodology because it's such a groundbreaking study. So you'd want to point that out. This study was replicated by so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so, who found consistent results or perhaps found inconsistent results. Guideline 8. Discuss other literature reviews on your topic. So in many cases, if you've picked a topic that has been around for a while, it's been researched for a while, it's an important topic, which hopefully your topic is important, other people have written on this. They've reviewed the literature. So this is not necessarily problematic. If you come across a literature review, it doesn't mean you have to abandon your topic because someone else has done it, but you do need to identify those reviews. So-and-so and so-and-so reviewed these topics and clarify how yours differs. So maybe yours is significantly more current. That one was published in 1998. Now it's in the 2000s, 2015, and so you have decided to update it. Did you delimit the topic in a different way? You're reviewing some articles that they didn't, so different look at that. Maybe yours is more comprehensive. They just picked a couple of key articles and you're reviewing all of them. Maybe you reach different conclusions. You have a different angle on it. So all of those would be things to consider when explaining why your review is different from previous reviews and hence necessary. Guideline 9. Refer the reader to other reviews on issues you will not be discussing in detail. So maybe there's a passing topic, you're talking about school bullying, and you bring up cyberbullying, which is more common now because of the increased use in technology among high school students. And so you don't necessarily want to go off on that tangent and review all the literature on the increase in technology use, but maybe someone else wrote about that. You could cite their study, so someone who's interested could go and read about that. Guideline 10. If there's an area where you don't find any research and you say, no studies were found, maybe you're writing about bullying, I don't know, I think that was an example in the textbook somewhere, that's on my mind. You're talking about bullying and you don't find any studies dealing with cyberbullying in elementary school. If you say, well, no studies were found dealing with this age span, you would need to justify that. And what that means is to explain how you came up with a conclusion that no studies are available. So you might say, I used these search terms in these databases, and based on that, no studies were found. Because the problem is there could be something out there that you didn't find, and if you're making the claim that no one's written about this, and you're wrong, it's going to look bad. You're going to lose credibility. But if maybe there's a article that was published in an online journal that's not cataloged in PsycInfo. So you say, I searched PsycInfo using these search terms, couldn't find anything. Someone else could say, well, there is this thing, but it wasn't in PsycInfo, so it's not really their fault. So at least you kind of covered your bases that way. Guideline 11, avoiding long lists of non-specific references. So here, there's a balance, right? We don't want an annotated bibliography, essentially, where you just have a series of annotations. You cite an article and describe it, new paragraph, new article, describe it, and they're sort of disconnected. You want to go idea by idea. You'll often cite multiple articles in the same paragraph as you're making a point. But differentiate. So if you're trying to make a point about the increase in school bullying in high school, you could cite a couple of key articles that look at trends over time. You don't need to cite every article that makes that same claim. 14 references. Perhaps one of the key articles contains its own references. If somebody really wanted to read about that, which occasionally happens, they could follow that trail. Guideline 12. It's common practice to include multiple references within the same parentheses, but they should all sort of be backing up the same point. They should all be in general agreement. If there's a discrepancy, if you're saying, well, some studies say this, but others disagree and say this, it needs to be clear which finding comes from which study. So you might want to separate those citations so that some studies say this, right? Citation, comma, but other studies disagree saying this, and then a new citation with those references. Guideline 13. Along those lines, speculate on the reasons for inconsistent findings in previous research. So if you're going through your lit review and you find that there is this disagreement in the literature, why might that be, right? So it's desirable to speculate in those cases. Make sure that your speculations are well informed. You've read the studies, you're comfortable discussing the differences, perhaps in methodology, operationalization of variables, different populations. And also make sure you speculate that, or you clarify that this is your speculation. Perhaps inconsistent findings are due to such and such. Guideline 14, cite all relevant references in the review section of the article. So this doesn't apply to you in your final paper because you're writing a standalone literature review, so there's really no other place for the citations to show up. But if you're introducing your own original empirical study, and you're getting ready, preparing the reader for this original research you're going to be talking about, typically it's good practice to include all of the citations up front as opposed to throwing out new ones later on. And finally, guideline 15. Emphasize the need for your study in the literature review section or chapter. So in this case, this would apply in the introduction which you've written. But again, double check, make sure that you've identified what makes your article unique and necessary. So this applies to empirical articles, but it also applies to standalone literature reviews such as the one you are writing. What are you contributing that's unique? Not just how is it useful. Some people get confused and they'll say this article is unique and valuable because it will help people understand bullying. So, well, that's great, but haven't other articles already been written on bullying? What are you doing that's different? Why wouldn't I just go read one of those articles? And why are you bothering to write this? So what's unique about what you're offering? All right, hope this is helpful to you. Thanks a lot. Let me know if you have any questions.